Okay, right, we're kicking off for our next very exciting discussion. I'm delighted to introduce to you all Dan Cllr, who is the CEO of the Fully Charged show. Dan, I will hand straight over to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the build-up. I hope we did disappoint you this morning with this session. So yes, my name's Dan Cllr from the Fully Charged show. I'm delighted to be joined by some expert panelists who we'll talk to shortly, including Chris Ashley, Policy Lead, Environment and Vehicles, the Road Haulage Association, Alistair Barnes, Senior Programme Manager, Land and Transport, Innovate UK, Cllr Miller, Mobility and Energy Advisor and former Director of Tech and Innovation at Octopus Electric Vehicles, and Councillor Dr. Pete Sudbury, who's insisted I can call him Pete, I believe, rather than Councillor every time, Deputy Leader of Climate Change, Environment and Future Generations from Oxfordshire County Council. So we've got a fantastic panel to talk to, but what I wanted to start with really is to get a feel for the audience, if that's okay. So it's easier to do audience participation when we're able to do it without the headphones, but I'm hoping this will still work. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and if you could put your hands up if the question answer applies to you. So who here has driven an electric vehicle? Pure electric vehicle. Hybrids don't count, just to be quite clear. Okay, hands down. Who actually owns a pure electric vehicle? Okay, slightly smaller group. And of those that own one, would any of you ever go back to a conventional combusting vehicle? I'm going to take that as a clear no. Who is on a green energy tariff for their home? Okay. And does anyone here have solar, a battery or heat pump already within their property? Okay, that's just to get a bit of a feel for who is in the audience and who we're talking to. What I think would be good to do, though, is to introduce everyone's credentials. So I'm going to go first very, very briefly. I run a YouTube channel. I didn't, when I was growing up, think that I'd be doing that because it didn't exist when I was growing up, but that's how my life worked out. And now I run a YouTube channel called The Fully Charged Show, a YouTube channel called The Everything Electric Show, and they're all about electric vehicles and clean energy, and we also run exhibitions called Everything Electric for consumers all around the world. And we run a anti-misinformation campaign called Stop Burning Stuff as well, or Stop BS as we call it sometimes, because unfortunately on this subject, the future of energy and transport, the Daily Mail are 99% inaccurate, so we're trying to correct some of those misinformations. Now let's start with Pete then on the other end. Could you tell us who you are and where you come from, Pete? Why are you on this panel?
That's a good question. So I'm a doctor by trade. I've got degrees in natural sciences and medicine. I did an MBA while I was training as a psychiatrist, and so I went into medical management, spent a lot of time in leadership positions in the NHS, escaped from that and worked for Hewlett-Packard on health IT for 3 years, then did agroforestry and silver pasture in Scotland for a couple of years before pretty much accidentally getting elected as a Green Party county councillor for Wallingford. I've been the cabinet member on what the Daily Mail calls Britain's wokest council. I've been the cabinet member for climate change. It is, no, indeed. And Jeremy Clarkson hates us too. Our climate programme was scored as the best county council climate programme by Climate Emergency UK. We've also benchmarked against the Carbon Disclosure Project, and we're in the top 25%. I'm here because we do quite a lot with EVs and EV charging. I can talk about that at some point.
Over to Claire.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Cllr Miller. I am a mobility and energy advisor. I work with startup companies and larger organisations, talking to them and helping them on their journey, whether that's at the very start, thinking about, is this technology going to help with decarbonising and electrifying different modes of transport? How does it interact with the grid, all the way through to customer experiences and helping some of our most vulnerable drivers get from ICE vehicles to electric. Formerly, I was the Director of... Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Yes, Director of Tech and Innovation at Octopus Electric Vehicles. So I was one of the sort of founding directors of the leasing business, and built everything that you need for leasing a vehicle. So we're going to talk about modes of sort of ownership and usership later. And at the same time, I delivered something called Powerloop, which is the first domestic vehicle-to-grid system from the cars and the chargers and getting grid permission, and how it works for a customer. So yeah, really excited to talk about all of those things today.
Thank you, Claire. Over to Alistair.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alistair Barnes from Innovate UK. Just to start off with, Innovate UK is the UK's innovation agency. We have a stand sort of at the back towards the main stage, and our main aim is around supporting innovation, working with companies to help them. Is this microphone? I don't know what I'm being told because I've got headphones on, so I can't hear anything. Okay, thank you. Don't talk. There we go. It's difficult, isn't it, when you're wearing headphones, you can't hear the real world. Innovate UK's innovation agency. We work with government and we try and help businesses to grow and to innovate and ultimately to help the UK economy. My role there is a senior program manager. I lead some different programs, but the main one is £200 million with the Department for Transport, and it's the Zero Emission HGV and Infrastructure Demonstration Programme. We are putting hundreds of electric lorries and some hydrogen fuel cell lorries onto the road over the next couple of years, and I'm quite happy to talk about that some more.
And finally, Chris.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. Chris Ashley from the Road Haulage Association. I speak on behalf of the operators of the lorries. And if you don't know about the RHA, we are a trade body. We have over 8,000 members who operate all around the UK. And between them, they run nearly half the lorry fleet of the UK. We predominantly focused on SMEs. They make up 85% of our membership. And my role at the RHA is to answer the decarbonisation question. In simple terms, how do we make the switch away from diesel lorries to the brave new world of electric and hydrogen that Alistair is leading on behalf of the government through Innovate UK. Just to give you some context here, there's just over 500,000 registered UK lorries on our roads. And the latest available figures is that of that 500,000, we've got 300 that are registered zero-emission HGVs at the moment. So we've got a long way to go, but I'm looking very much forward to this discussion in terms of what we could do to make that transition happen.
So we've got a great panel, credentials established, so we're going to get into the topics, but we are actually running Slido here, so you can actually use Slido to actually put your questions in for us as well, and we'll get onto those a little bit later in the session. But let's start with some simple things. This session is about renewable energy, light vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles as well. Let's start with the energy mix. It's changed substantially in the UK over the last 12 years or so as coal has come off the grid and wind has predominantly replaced it. So EVs are actually cleaner, even on a dirty grid, than their previous combustion engine vehicles. But the mix is changing, and we don't have to answer all the questions, each of you. I might start with Claire on this one, because I know this is her area. The energy mix has changed. Tell us how it's changed, and tell us how you think it might change over the next few years.
Yeah, it is I think, under-celebrated and under-discussed topic in how the energy mix has changed in the UK quite so dramatically. And actually, there are now days where the grid is running completely green and the carbon intensity is so very low, and we are just not shouting about it enough. So, to your point, we've pretty much divested ourselves of coal. We still have coal on standby for the coldest winter days when there's not much wind and not much sun. But we're relying less and less on burning things, to your point, and we are moving more to renewable generation. But as we move to that renewable generation, something we have to think about is storage. And I think that's another really important part now of our next stage of how the UK moves to an even cleaner and greener grid. So it's great that we've stopped having that reliance on burning stuff all the time to meet peak demands, which in the UK often at tea time, the classic, put your kettle on, lots of demand on the grid. But we also are now needing places to store energy because the sun doesn't always shine. And to your point about wind, we have a huge amount of wind. We're a very windy island. We're very lucky to have that, but it isn't always windy. So I think as we start to think about, okay, that's great, but what next? Storage and when we use energy is going to become increasingly more important, and that's how we will drive more renewables onto the grid than we have today, which is already really impressive. and actually enable that highly renewable grid of the future. Super green, and storage is an absolutely key part of that.
And Claire, the role of bidirectional charging, that being vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, or vehicle to load, all those different things, where might that play a role and how soon?
Yeah, the killer, how soon at the end. When we think about storage, storage can be using energy, anything that uses energy, at a time when there's too much energy being put onto the grid to help keep the grid in balance. And that's something else as we think about how we use energy and when we use it. Our energy grid needs to stay in balance between load and generation, or export from places where it's stored. And then vehicle to grid, again, I'll do a quick show of hands. Who has heard of vehicle to grid, V to export? Yeah, see, it's so great. So folks are starting to learn about it. Obviously, this is a really expert audience, and I imagine all of you will have your own areas of energy expertise and decarbonisation expertise, and that's probably why you guys sort of know about it. Information about it is getting out more widely, and passenger vehicle companies are talking about it more. So, for example, people like Renault are launching a car at the start of next year. Renault 5 will come back with vehicle to grid technology. Volvo, there are others. And that's going to be a really important part of the mix. So vehicle to grid won't give us all the capacity we need, but if you think about the amount of time that cars are standing still, it's about 90% of the time, passenger vehicles. And I know Pete will probably talk about this in detail about, do we need all those cars stationary and standing? But as part of that mix, when those vehicles are standing, they're a place to store energy. So on a sunny day, possibly more applicable in Australia or California, but we do have them here, and we will have this more. There'll be lots of daytime generation, so a place to store the energy, and enabling the full potential of an electric vehicle is that vehicle can also give that energy back to a building or other vehicles or to the grid at times when that makes sense. So we burn even less stuff, we move away from that. We have places to store energy when it's being generated, and we can then share it around as it's needed. So I guess if there's one thing to take away, it's that it's very real, it definitely works. It's at my house. I'm very lucky to have worked on a project which meant I did the testing at my home, and so we're coming up for 4 years of vehicle to grid. So it definitely works, and it definitely can be done. We're relying on the vehicle manufacturers, and maybe we'll get onto some of the larger vehicles as well, which could have duty cycles that would be applicable. But it's, you're going to hear more and more about it this year and next year, and then for mass market, probably 2026 onwards, we'll start to see it.
We're going to move through lighter vehicles to heavy duty vehicles, but I'd just like to say, for Alistair, for Chris, what do you have to say about larger vehicles and vehicle to grid? We can see quite a lot of projects going around the world, US school buses that are used in the morning and they're used in the afternoon, but they just sit there idle for the rest of the time as they use as one big battery. We see that in San Diego, for example. What do you see? Do you see that kind of haulage and heavy-duty vehicles moving in that direction? Perhaps both of you could give us an answer on that.
Yeah, sure, Dan. So Innovate UK is already working with a number of projects that are looking at vehicle to grid on larger vehicles, buses as an example, as you said. And it's definitely going to be important in the future. It will probably be a revenue source for these operators, and as what they do changes, then they will need to look at how they can adapt and what makes the most sense in the future. So, yeah, that as an energy source, as a revenue source in the future is really important. And there's loads. As Claire said, it's happening. It already works perfectly well. It's just sort of making it to a point where it's commercially set up and standardised. But there's plenty that can be done now as well, just with smart charging. So, as an example, my car at home, I plug it in. It very often, almost never starts charging instantly. It might start charging at 3 in the morning, and it'll be the same with commercial vehicles. So many of them do have a reasonably long dwell time. They might only run during the day and then don't do anything at night. And they might not charge constantly at a steady pace. They might do nothing for 3 hours, and then when the wind blows somewhere nearby, then that might be when they kick in, and that gives them lower cost of energy. And then ultimately, as I say, the back and forth might give you the chance for revenue.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I think I'm going to echo what Alistair has just said, which is anything's possible, basically, in terms of vehicle to grid from an HGV perspective. What I would just say, though, is that it does very much depend on operational requirements. Yes, it is true that there will be some lorries with dwell time overnight, but we shouldn't assume that that's the case everywhere. And one of the challenges is a feature of our haulage industry right now. You do have lorries operating basically 24/7. And that's one of the challenges actually that we need to sort of address during the transition, is how that need can be accommodated so that, you know, those lorries which run 24/7, you know, they deliver an economic service. Let's not forget about this, you know, they keep the cost of goods, certainly the transport of goods, as low as it can possibly be. That all has an impact. So I think, you know, to sum up, yes, the principle is there. We can make vehicle to grid work, but we do need to work through how it can work in reality during this transition. And, you know, from our perspective, this is actually how ZHID, the trial, and other trials going around will help sort out. So it's very much something to keep an eye on.
Okay, so quick final word from Cllr on this.
I was just going to say, when I talk on panels, I try to give people a takeaway or like things you can go and kind of look up afterwards. So just taking your point, in terms of operational vehicles, and in fact in terms of the vehicles that we have at home, we can always think, to your point about, you know, there are always vehicles that won't suit. There's a few projects that are out there looking at vehicles who have operational duty cycles that it definitely works for. So bin lorries in the UK, we don't have school buses unfortunately, we have bin lorries. So Veolia is active in V2X for bin lorries as an example. And then there's Royal Mail working with a bi-directional wireless charging company called Electric Green, and you know, they're looking at, you know, post vans come back and sit for a long time, but those vehicles still have quite a lot of charging. So there's two projects to go and have a look, have a Google, because it's being tested right now, and there are definitely vehicles they also will not work for. So we have to find the right use cases.
Great, so let's go from the sort of smaller vehicles now, and then we'll come back to the larger vehicles in a moment. But let's start with the smaller vehicle of all, you know, actually getting rid of vehicles. This conference is called Innovation Zero, and actually if we move from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, for example, at a passenger level, won't we have missed an opportunity if we make exactly the same number of vehicles, or perhaps even put more out there? Isn't there room for fewer vehicles, smaller vehicles, lighter vehicles, shared vehicles? Pete, over to you.
There isn't just room, there is an absolute need for that. 10 billion people in two-class EV families is no more sustainable than the current wrecking system. We currently are exceeding 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries by very significant amounts. We have to consume less and travel less and do less damaging things. And my job is around that. It's also around resilience and climate adaptation. And if you think about the pillars, the things that keep society going, it's power, water, food, safe shelter, transport and logistics, ICT. Take out any of those and you're in a bit of trouble. Take out power and you're in trouble almost instantly because you can't pump water and sewage. And V2G and behind the meter storage is one way of building resilience at a hyper local level. If we can divide the grid into local grids that can stand up when the main stuff goes down, then that gives us 48 hours. And in fact, I have somewhere on the ship, somewhere on the seas, there are 75 kilowatt hours of lithium iron phosphate battery that I've ordered from China to connect to my 10 kilowatts of solar, and I intend to start trading on the grid and become part of the resilience, the grid balancing and resilience solution. In terms of using fewer cars, right now there's a lot of car dependency. In Oxfordshire, it's easy to take the car journeys out of the city. All the short car journeys you can take out. In the countryside, it's harder and the journeys are longer. 90% of our vehicle emissions are actually outside the city of Oxford. And so what we did, first of all, I think it was Innovate UK gave us the money, and we put chargers in car parks in market towns. Street chargers are rubbish in Oxfordshire because most of the pavements are really narrow, to the extent we always put the street lights at the back, and the last thing you want to do is clutter them with some more stuff. So we put them in car parks, and then we launched in market towns, and we think it's the biggest market rollout of shared vehicles outside of cities. we launched car clubs. We persuaded them to put in EV vehicles, which of course is a gateway thing, that people can hire a vehicle that's an EV which they've never used before, and maybe the next time they buy one. The evidence says that every car club car takes out about 20 private cars. And as you move to a fully electrical world, most of the damage an EV does is before it hits the road. That's the damage to the environment. So if we could get rid of the second car by making that the thing people use car clubs for, that would be great. And of course, those car club cars, when they're not being used, they can be on the V2G. And actually, it was very exciting for me to meet Cllr, because my officers are saying the problem with V2G is that there's no accepted standard at the moment. But actually, it sounds like Cllr is making one, so I'll just follow that.
Thank you very much. So I'm not particularly going to obsess about cars today. You'll be delighted to hear. If you want to ask me about electric cars afterwards, I can take questions on that. I talk about it, and I've lived with them for years. I've had electric cars for 9 years, done about 300,000 miles. It's really, really easy if you are able to go and buy one, and you won't look back. But just one quick question for passenger vehicles before we move on to the meatier end, and we give Chris and Alistair their say. I guess probably for Pete and Cllr, I'm going to lob this one up, as you're probably a bit freer speaking. Do you see any major role for hydrogen at passenger vehicle level?
No. And hydrogen, remember that if you look at the IEA high hydrogen scenario, it's a third more power generation needed to do that. You need I think it's about 5 times less energy efficient to make hydrogen and then stick it and compress it, transport it and stick it in a vehicle than it is to stick the electricity straight in the vehicle and drive it. So hydrogen is it's necessary. If you look at Michael Liebrich, he's got a lovely hydrogen ladder, hasn't he? And he doesn't put small vehicles anywhere on that. Shipping, fertilizers and so on, yes, you need hydrogen for that, but really not for small cars.
Also Michael Liebrich's hydrogen ladder. You've stolen my thunder, which is good. If you don't know about it yet, go and have a look. And I think, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I am dispassionate about the technology, but very passionate about the impact and the outcomes that it has. And so something I got challenged on this a lot more impolitely by someone the other day on a panel, and my answer was, there's no law against building hydrogen technologies, there's no law against building out the ecosystem, there's nothing stopping you, but there's also a free market for battery technologies, and the way that battery technologies and chemistries are advancing, power density is increasing as cost is going down. We're seeing sub $100 per kilowatt hour batteries and sub, right? That curve, again, another one to go and look up, like looking up the price of LFP batteries, for example. So it's an open market, and it's an open sort of technology market as well. And as those technologies are increasing, I think that's really fascinating. We start to talk about heavier stuff that not only are we seeing doesn't make any sense for smaller vehicles because the batteries themselves already do what they need to do. And we talk about people's first and second EVs. The first EV people buy has a really long range, and the second one they buy has a much shorter range, which actually suits their day-to-day. So there's a whole topic there of usership and experience and learning. But also, as we start to get into the bigger vehicles, although we know that there's lots of interesting projects and exploration and keeping it open, battery chemistries are increasing and improving so fast. I actually think it's important to debate how fast it will catch up in order to be suitable for longer runs, heavier duty, heavier loads, and actually the infrastructure that goes along with that. And I think that's where we start to talk about megawatt charging. And megawatt charging is coming for larger vehicles, and standards is part of a set of standards. But we should be thinking about, are we going to need it, or how much will we actually need it, given the way that the other technologies are racing ahead? And I think at the moment there isn't really a straight answer. But when then you come back to hydrogen, it has the potential. But does it have the road ahead? That's the open question for the bigger vehicles.
So we think it's pretty cut and dried for passenger vehicles, but it's a different story. It's not quite as straightforward for larger vehicles. And I think really Chris and Alistair could talk to that a little bit more. Certainly what I know is we do a lot of work in Canada, where there are wide open spaces. We do a lot of work in Australia, where there are wide open spaces. And hydrogen for heavy duty is actually much more appealing in those areas for a variety of different reasons. But I think really, just Chris, Are you dispassionate, passionate? What are you? Where do you stand? And how do you see it playing out with kind of Road Haulage Association?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say a light blue touch paper and stand well back as we go into the hydrogen versus electric debate. Look, from our perspective, we're very clear it's too soon to start ruling out technologies. Okay, there are challenges, there's opportunities but challenges behind both technologies. Yes, the battery market, we hear, the chemistries are improving all the time. That's great. For us, there are still, though, issues about range, and also, it is about range and sort of the charging time it takes up, which potentially hydrogen can overcome. And so, I mean, our stance basically is to say we have to allow the market to innovate. Right now. That's why, obviously, the government has set up its £200 million trial in order to test these assumptions. And I think that's where we stand. I'm not. What I would just say in terms of my vested interest in all of this, because we get drawn in. Is it going to be batteries? Is it going to be hydrogen for heavy good vehicles? I'm going to say somewhat controversially. Actually, I don't care. I don't care whether it's battery or hydrogen. What I care about is how the goods can get from A to B. And if it's best done by battery or if it's best done by hydrogen, that is what we will determine as our knowledge and understanding increases. And I think what I would just say to sort of the battery and hydrogen advocates is actually it is up to those advocates to prove why the haulier, in my case, should be spending lots of money on either technology. We know we've got to decarbonise. There are a range of solutions that are available to us, and I think just given where we are in this debate, our stance is we do need to allow the market to innovate.
I'm going to jump in just as you're maybe passing over the mic to say it's not electric versus hydrogen. It has to be electric and hydrogen, because even in a hydrogen vehicle, it's a hydrogen fuel cell and a battery, right? So those technologies have to live alongside each other within that system.
That's my point, Claire.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was taking it from P, you took my point. So.
Well, Alistair, when you finished expanding on that point that Claire's just stolen, can you also tell us about the freightway that's planned as well?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So, where to start now? So, I think I agree with all the points that have just been made, right? With the programme that I talked about earlier, with the government-funded programme, we're looking at both technologies. And that's not putting a battery vehicle and a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle next to each other doing the same thing. It's understanding where they best fit and the pros and cons in each of those, because there's a huge variety in what lorries do, and the different technologies will have a better fit for different operations. So that's one side. Another side is if you wanted to decarbonise your diesel lorry now, then there are plenty of alternative fuels, and Zima Partnership have done a lot to try and understand how well they work in practice and promote those. And then if you want to look at zero emission today, then really it's a battery electric lorry. You can't really buy a hydrogen fuel cell lorry today. And it's quite nice. Near where I live in South Wales, there is I think a couple of electric lorries that sort of I see on the road quite regularly. They're not government funded, they're doing commercial operation, they're real, they're happening right now. So that side is very exciting. And then moving on into the sort of the practical side of the ZHID program that we talked about a moment ago, we have a couple of hundred vehicles going to the road. So we have a project that's led by GridServe, which is called the Electric Freightway, which will be above 100 vehicles. It will have lorry recharging at depots where the vehicles are stationary, but then also opportunity or on-the-go charging. So some motorway service areas, maybe near you or near I, will end up with electric lorry chargers within the next year or so. It's really happening quite quickly. We have another project called E-Freight 2030, which is again up to 100 or so vehicles. We'll have some really big depots with charging for many lorries. And then there's a hydrogen side, which is slightly further behind, but we'll definitely see enough hydrogen vehicles go onto the road and the refuelling using green, renewably generated hydrogen. And that will allow us to, as I say, to look at the different use cases, understand how it all works in practice, generate data which we'll share publicly with, maybe next year or the year after is this sort of event, or in reports to operators, and try and get that learning out there and use that to accelerate the transition for more people.
That's great.
Can I just sort of just add to a couple of points that what Alistair was just saying? I mean, I think also it's important to just recognise, we take a very pragmatic stance to decarbonisation, and again, I want to emphasise the point that where we can decarbonise, we must. And so, where the vehicles are on the market and they are proven to work for a particular use case, absolutely, hauliers should be doing what they can, to introduce these vehicles into their fleets. So I think what we're looking for from a pragmatic perspective is this graduated transition. To pick up on some of the points I think that Claire's been making, there will be some operations which will be electric. But right now I think there will be some operations that could well be hydrogen as well. It's too early though to say, and that's what we need to sort out and understand as part of this journey towards net zero.
That's great. That's a very sensible debate. As someone who used to work for a fuel cell company, I understand both sides of the coin, and I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I think almost everyone would agree, though, it's green hydrogen we're after, made from renewables, not grey hydrogen or any other kind of colour of hydrogen that we're looking for. So let's go to the Slido questions. We've got quite a few. First one I'm going to take, but get ready, I'm going to fire these at you. You don't all have to respond to each one. For the first one, it's for vehicle to grid. I worry about accelerated degradation of my car battery capacity. There's no proof of that, actually. There are many trials around the world for vehicle to grid. One of my favourite ones is We Drive Solar's huge V2G project with Hyundai Ioniq 5s in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and actually I know the guy who runs that very, very well. There are actually some signs that actually it is benefiting battery life. If you can imagine, if you're accelerating a car, you're making that battery do an awful lot of work, but actually if you're using it for a building for some sort of other means, it's actually not been worked anything like as hard. So I think we'll slay that myth.
He
and move
literally
on to the
took
next
my
one.
answer,
Oh,
my
good.
example, everything I was going to say.
Good. That's good. That's good. I'm still
Battery
in touch.
amelioration. I'll add one tiny battery chemistry thing, which is, reducing dendritic growth in the battery. If anyone's like a battery geek, the way you drive your car and actually rapid charging is not great for your car. If you want to extend the life, get it doing a bit of gentle AC V2G overnight. But
So if you'd like to talk to Cllr about dendrites earlier, I advise that would be a good conversation. So in terms of charging, moving to that, we've been asked about the wait times for grid upgrades. Not the wait times at charging. I think I've experienced one wait in like 9 years. But actually, regional grids are, if not a capacity, it's the connections that we need to put in. How do we meet the charging demand with these constraints? I'm looking at Alistair, but maybe we'll take this one.
I guess the advantage of putting a load of public money, taxpayer money, into this sort of sector is you can really flush out these problems, and you get the opportunity to kind of jump 5 years ahead and see how hard all this stuff is in practice. So that's one angle. So the more that we can do now, the more that will help us to do it better, quicker, easier, cheaper in the future. And then maybe another angle is that the amount of grid upgrades that I think are sort of happening concurrently now are massively higher than they were years ago. So it's not a huge surprise that this is a pain point for everyone at the moment. It's a huge growth area, and you need new skills, new people, and new processes to do all this sort of thing. So it'll happen. It'll be a bit painful. It's part of what we need to do to mobilise energy systems.
It is great to see the system wake up, and you just think that's the idea of regulators being asleep at the wheel for 30 years is not an unfamiliar one. We've got the same with water, haven't we? And I can recall, actually, just when the cost of living crisis came in, I think Ofgem consulted on not allowing any new grid connections. And my officers wrote a really nice, polite response, and I changed it quite a lot to make it a great deal harsher. Because, in fact, particularly in Oxfordshire, where we have quite a lot of innovation, it's completely critical to get on with it, and luckily they decided not to do that bit. But it is wonderful to see. You couldn't imagine them doing that now, and that's not many years later.
The only thing I would add is actually that there is a balance for lots of these projects between do you have the land, do you have the grid connection, and therefore do you also have the planning. And I think that there is part of this that we don't necessarily want to grapple with yet, whilst possibly in the same breath saying, but I mean, look at China, look at how they're racing ahead, and look at this country and that country. And that is that, yes, you need the grid upgrade, but often that means you need the planning, and to get the planning, that often means that things need to happen in that vicinity, which may be very unpalatable to the people that live and work in that vicinity, to do with building out the infrastructure. So it's not as simple as clicking our fingers, sticking the cables under the ground and suddenly the grid connection's there. So there are payoffs. It is that classic, how do you balance it? And we don't want to be doing ecological damage whilst also upgrading as part of that. So I think there's a more nuanced conversation that will need to be had about where these things will just have to happen, and then that how do you compensate and support people who are impacted with it in their local area, because at some point it will come to a complete head and we won't be able to make any progress without tackling that planning.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris, I think this is one for you. What do you think about the role of biodiesel in the heavy transport space, both during the energy transition and in the longer term?
Yeah, so we're on record to say that we definitely see a role for low carbon fuels as a interim measure to help the fleet decarbonise. Because the technology's there. Basically, you can put HVO or biodiesel or whatever into the existing fleet, and the claims are it can reduce emissions by up to 90%. And and for us, again, we take this pragmatic stance. That seems to be an eminently sensible thing to do. If I was to take the moral argument, it's about, I think the issue about surely it's better to save every tonne of carbon now through whatever means we have available to us, such as low carbon fuels, rather than waiting for a potentially perfect solution to come along, which may take some time to come across. Now, what I will just say is that there are, and I do accept that there are challenges behind that argument. The supply of low carbon fuels is very, very small, and of course nobody wants to be chopping down rainforests to grow the crops, to manufacture these fuels. That said, it is possible to source these fuels sustainably, and I think we have to be pragmatic now in this transition, and so that's why we would say, low carbon fuels has this role to play.
Pete?
So we have a report, written by the Environmental Change Institute on how to decarbonise the whole of Oxfordshire. And Nick Eyre, who wrote it, says the one bit he regrets is putting in things about biofuels. You get about 30 times as much energy per acre from solar that you do from growing bio crops. At some point, as soon as you expand beyond using waste oil, somewhere you start growing bio crops. Somewhere else, someone chops down a bit of forest to grow the corn that should have been grown there. There is a zero-sum game around that, and we should avoid it as much as we can, because it's actually not doing any good.
Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's lots of debate around the kind of current stage, and generally I think it's probably better than diesel, but the point I was going to make is it's definitely not a long-term solution, because you never have enough of it, and you also have to take a step away from just transport or road transport and think about maritime, shipping, aviation, and all those things. And generally they're much more difficult to decarbonise sectors that will ultimately pay more money because they don't have an alternative in some cases.
Great. We have about 7 minutes remaining. I'm going to try and squeeze 2 or 3 more questions if I can. I'll take this one. Is the transfer from ICE cars to EVs more about saving the car industry than true decarbonisation? Most of the car industry is being dragged kicking and screaming to electric vehicles. The thought it is going to save the car industry is a fallacy. In fact, it probably will decimate some of the existing car companies as the likes of Tesla and Chinese car companies mop up market share. What about retrofitting trucks, Alistair? Chris, has that come up much? That's something we're being asked about here, the opportunity to retrofit vehicles, particularly on sort of trucks and heavy duty.
Maybe we could start with Lunaz and what's happened there.
Yeah.
So Lunaz, some of you might be aware of Lunaz as a very nice sort of classic car retrofitter who moved into retrofitting bin lorries, and we're going great guns with it.
Great episode on the Fully Charged.
Great
show.
episode on Fully Charged.
Yep.
Other YouTube channels are available, but they're not worth watching. But what's happened there is, unfortunately, for like various kind of economic factors, as I can understand it, they have had to put a kind of hard pause on that activity. So I think from that perspective, can be done, but where's the market for those vehicles, rather than it's not possible. That, I don't know what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, for some vehicle types, it makes a lot of sense to try and get rid of the engine, keep all the good bits that are all perfectly good, and sort of swap them over to electrification. I think vehicles only have a limited lifetime anyway, so in most cases it's not going to be relevant, but there are definitely places where it is. One of the projects I've been involved in previously has had the NHS in Wales using some electric lorries. About half of those were repowered, originally diesel lorries, and the other half of them were just sort of a chassis that never had an engine, but then had a battery and motor added to it. And there's no real difference, right? It does the same sort of job, and to the person who's driving the vehicle, it probably doesn't make very much difference. It's just figuring out where it makes sense commercially, and understanding that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, just thinking this through, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, is what I want to say. Whether we're talking about low carbon fuels or retrofitting existing vehicles, because yes, it's possible to retrofit, a diesel lorry. JCB, okay, other other manufacturers are available. Let me just say that. But JCB, I know, have developed a product for their diggers where they can swap out their diesel vehicles with hydrogen combustion engines. Now, but therein lies another challenge, hydrogen combustion. Does that have a role to play in decarbonisation? We, the RHA, would say yes, it does. But because hydrogen combustion does generate trace amounts of emissions, so the view of the government at the moment is, well, we don't really want to encourage hydrogen combustion. Yeah, there's some trade-offs, I think, to be had here, and as I say, we take this very pragmatic view. It's interesting, listening to this discussion. I mean, I think it's worth saying there is no silver bullet solution here. There's a range of options available to us, and I think we all just have to have the courage to grasp those options, recognise the difficulties and challenges with each of them, so that we actually start doing something, as opposed to just talking about it all the time.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, I think from our perspective, we would look at the economies of scale that solar, battery, wind, and ultimately electric vehicles are going to go through as a huge advantage. But certainly for the heavier end of the market, nothing is yet set in stone. So let's finish with one more question, if we may, which I think is a good one. And again, kind of feels like this person might have read the Daily Mail, but we're going to go with it. And apologies if you wrote this question. What are your thoughts about the environmental impact of EV batteries, rare earth minerals, lithium, etc., especially as the adoption of EVs increase? I mean, I would say categorically it's well known now, and it's been proven that a electric vehicle economy will rely on far less mining and materials, far less than what we're currently doing. I should put that out there right away. And also, rare earth minerals, they're not rare at all. And maybe Cllr can talk to new battery chemistries as well in a minute, and how we're not reliant on lithium and cobalt, for example. Pete wants to go first, I think.
Yes, I think there was something in Carbon Brief that was about 500 times less mining for an electric economy. A 1 megawatt coal station uses 300,000 tonnes of coal every year. Okay, that's the size of it. 40% of all shipping carries fossil fuels right now. So that's the size of the stuff you're taking out when you complain about digging for rare earths. What isn't great is that there are slave children digging it, but that's about abolishing child slavery. That's about assuring your supply chains. That's about making sure that your suppliers act ethically.
Yeah,
it's not about delaying
That's also associated with cobalt in very, very
Yes.
small quantities. I'm not wishing to downplay that.
Yes.
Cobalt is being removed from car batteries. For LFP batteries, which is lithium
Yes,
ion phosphate,
indeed.
solid state, etc. So that's actually a small area which is being very, very aggressively targeted.
Yeah, absolutely killer point about 40% of shipping is about moving fossil fuels around. If you take nothing else away, just take that away, have a think. and what that would do immediately to global emissions if that shipping wasn't required. The other point around battery chemistries, we're moving from NMC, which does rely on things like manganese, cobalt, to things like LFP, which do not have those. And we're now seeing sodium-ion technologies coming, which are made of ultimately salt and other bits, which don't at all rely on those metals. So we're already seeing...
And are recyclable as well.
And that's my other point. I felt like we're like the most boring pun up. We're like, yes, and I agree with you, and you've got my point. But it's true. These batteries are eminently recyclable, and we have a nascent recycling community in the UK. And I think when you think about, we aren't a natural kind of hotspot for natural minerals. Think about all those vehicles that are driving around today. They can become the materials of tomorrow that we need here, and that is going to be more and more important as we go forward. So the final point I think you made, which is incredibly important, is when you think about ESG, and for your businesses and where you're thinking about switching to electric vehicles or other drivetrains and what that might mean, securing your supply chains is super important. And so another company I'll give a shout out to, an absolutely world-leading company, startup in the UK called Infios. They are looking at how do you secure that ESG supply chain, the people who are involved, the technologies, because as you say, it doesn't matter if we're not making progress on those topics, then it's still having a negative impact, even though the other impacts are so important.
So we're at 12:15, and I'm scratching the surface of the knowledge that we have here from the panellists. So I want to say thank you to Pete, to Claire, to Alistair, and to Chris. I am sure that they will be happy to talk to you after this about further details that we just simply cannot cover in a mere 45-minute slot. Thank you very much. One last thing I've been asked to remind people is please don't take the headphones with you. Some people have been doing that, so if you could not do that, that would be great. And thank you very much for coming today and paying such close attention.